All right, welcome to the Golden Shadow. My name is Arran Rogerson, and I'm here with Alyssa Polizzi. Today we are exploring the mythology surrounding Hades and Persephone. We're going to talk about each of these figures, their role in the Greek mythological universe, what their psychological significance might be, and how they appear in other myths. So, Alyssa, tell us about Hades.
Hades, the Greek god of the underworld, is a really interesting figure in the pantheon or the general uh, full lineup of Greek gods because being an underworld figure, Hades is an individual who's more in the shadows compared to the Olympians who have a range of mythologies and stories and rites and really worships. We see that the underworld gods are a little bit more in shadow. Hades, as a figure of the underworld, can sometimes be conflated with what we might say is more of like our Western belief system of hell or the underworld being this place of punishment. But for the Greeks, the underworld was really a place of the afterlife and of the depths, and less to do with punishment and more to do with this other phase of life after the one that you were living was over. So, God of the underworld is more equated to God of the depths, God of the riches, God of the unseen. And Hades really starts in that place as being this shadowy underworld god who doesn't have as many stories as, say, Zeus, but plays a role that is a little bit more underground.
Yeah, I think just the naming of Hades, or what his name is interpreted as, is quite interesting. Just to start off with, Hades, I think it's kind of controversial what his name actually translates to, and there's a notion that Hades means the unseen one, or the invisible one, or you might say like the one who lingers in the shadows. Um, so that's interesting already, and that has some ties with, again, the concept of the shadow that we talk about so much, um, and sort of the realm that is either out of view, or maybe it's suppressed or denied or ignored, right? But Hades could also be translated as knower of all noble things, which I think is also very interesting, because then you have this sort of convergence of the shadow as being a place of like noble truth, or a place that needs to be explored in order to gain these noble truths. So he's the unseen one, but he's also the one who knows things, right? And again, so you're getting into this like golden shadow idea with Hades.
Mm.
And then beyond that, you have Pluto, or Pluton is another name for Hades, and that means wealthy or riches, right? And so you have even more explicitly this golden shadow idea, partly because the ground is full of wealth. It's where crops come from. It's where water can come from, and it's where minerals like and ores like gold can come from. So there's like riches from underground, but there's also this idea that there are riches that come from beneath, or that come from the shadow, or come from the underworld, and that could be a personal underworld. And so that's very interesting. The naming to start off with is already getting at something that I think is quite complex.
Yeah, absolutely. And psychologically, we start to see the underworld, Hades, being connected to the unconscious space and having this aspect of the psyche that is so full of these depths that we can't fully comprehend, understand, and influence us in these sort of unseen ways. We then look at what power and what insights and the exploration that comes from us mining those depths of tapping into the unconscious space of the psyche and being able to draw out this wealth of knowledge, some sort of higher sort of order, you might say, that exists in the underworld. And Hades really circumambulates that idea in an interesting way, because not only is he seen as the ruler of this space, but he's an ordering principle in the underworld. He is not a punishing God. He's more kind of like following a natural order, you might say. Like, if you die, you cannot leave the underworld. This is just the way that it is. He's seen as quite just and quite fair, but having these rules that have to be abided by. So he is really, in many ways, a reflection of Zeus, but in the darker, shadowy underworld space, and sometimes is even referred to as like the chthonic Zeus rather than Hades.
Right. So there's three brothers: Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon.
Mhm.
And the story is that they overthrew Kronos, right? Their
Yeah,
father.
yeah, yeah,
Kronos
and all the
swallowed
Titans,
them,
yeah. Mhm.
right? And Hades is the eldest of his brothers, and
Yeah.
then they're regurgitated. Zeus comes out first, Hades comes out last. It's my understanding. But anyways, they
Zeus,
overthrow
yeah,
Kronos,
yeah.
and
It
they take over the cosmos.
yeah, yeah, the battle against the Titans, which is sort of like the old order of Greek gods, are defeated by the Olympians, Hera, Demeter, Poseidon, Zeus, Hades, etc. And after that, these sort of three ruling principles of the brothers, Poseidon, Zeus, and Hades, each sort of draw. Uh, for their
Lots.
land, yeah, they draw their lots, and Hades receives the underworld, and Poseidon receives the oceans, and um, Zeus, of course, receives the heavens. And you know, it would be interesting. We haven't really gone into this before, but often the oceans are seen as another really potent symbol of the unconscious space, especially in dreams. Another like mythological fairy tale imagery. So we're talking about Hades as a representation of the unconscious and in more of the shadows and more of the underworld sense, but Poseidon has his own realm, being that of the ocean, that connects back to the unconscious space as well. But that's a discussion for another time.
Hades is rarely depicted because he's the unseen one, because he's
Yeah,
the invisible one. That there actually aren't that many images of Hades that you can find historically. I think
yeah,
even this sculpture, I think, is like pseudo Hades. This is like a Ptolemaic Egyptian interpretation of Hades. I think it even had a different name. I can't remember what it is.
hmm,
But that it's thought of as being the equivalent to Hades, but not actually Hades himself. But anyways,
okay,
the images of Hades are like few and far between, and
yeah,
but when he is depicted, there are several things he usually has with him. One is the most obvious is Cerberus, the three-headed dog.
yeah.
Uh, that's interesting. Why three heads? Do you have anything to
I
say about
think
that? What's up with
I
Cerberus?
think if I'm just to draw very generalized connections around animal imagery, is often that these are reflections of the powerful instincts, especially in the unconscious or in the somatic unconscious. So, in talking about Hades as this figure of the underworld, as a expression of shadowy unconscious, we also have the instincts, our biological instincts. And Cerberus is this extension, really, of Hades. He guards the underworld. He is often there are many stories about Cerberus, probably more than there are actually about Hades. But I see Cerberus ultimately, at least in one facet, as this instinctual principle that exists in the unconscious space, and that when we go into that underworld, when we dip into the unconscious, we have to face the instinctual aspects of our own psyche, and contend with them. And that is what every person has to deal with as they enter into the underworld. They must pass through where Cerberus protects. I mean, he doesn't allow people to leave necessarily, and he'll allow them in. So just an instinctual principle that I think is an interesting manifestation of Hades.
Hades also has a helm or a cap of invisibility. Um, Again, that's sort of tied to his unseen quality or his
Hmm.
inability to be sort of captured or held in view.
Yeah.
And I guess these are some examples of the helm.
Yeah, these are like different figures who wear the helmet throughout different stories. We have Perseus holding Medusa's head. We have Hermes, who is known to wear the helmet at times, and Athena, who wore it during, I think, the Trojan War against Ares.
Mhm.
So these different figures took on the helmet, were able to sort of embody that unseeingness and prevail in some way. But it's ultimately attributed back to Hades. And so this principle of being invisible or really being able to influence a situation, but do so in a way that is shrouded is the realm of Hades.
Hmm. That's interesting. It
Hmm.
also ties into Hades being kind of altruistic in some ways,
Yeah.
um, not really being a villain or a bad guy, uh,
Hmm.
like we would like to believe with most universes is that there's some sort of satanic figure. So it must be Hades. But here's Hades lending out his helm and doing people favors even, and kind of
Yeah.
trying to just sort of maintain his rules and protect the underworld, which is possibly a difficult and thankless job for him, and that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Persephone.
Tell us about Persephone.
Persephone. One thing to note about Persephone is that her original name is Kor or Kore, which means maiden or young girl. So she's really known initially as a kind of unshaped, young, uninitiated feminine figure. The maiden who is in that sort of puella state, just pure young girl, has not moved into the world in a way where she's experienced challenge or strife. She still lingers around her mother's robes. And her main story, of course, is about the abduction, but she has one facet, which is the aspect of the feminine principle that is sweet and innocent and young and full of potential. And her story takes her into that sort of next stage of development, you might say. She's known as Demeter's daughter, who is the goddess of the earth and of the grain, and is known as like the kind of fertility of the harvest. And some historians sort of trace Demeter and Persephone back to like a core kind of mother goddess who eventually split into these two feminine principles. So sometimes Persephone is just thought of as like the kind of dark half of Demeter, the aspect of earth and the fertility of the spring cycle that is underground until it emerges back into the light of day. But for our purposes, she's the daughter of Demeter, and a young innocent figure.
Right. So she's pure
Mm,
and naive.
yeah.
So she's sort of a blank slate in some ways. She's kind of she hasn't been stained yet by reality. She hasn't been brought
Mm,
into personhood yet,
yeah. Yeah.
you might
Maturity.
say.
Hmm.
And that is, a state for all of us as a child for a long time. So for some of us longer than others, but this is this sort of state of naivete and innocence and hopefully carefreeness, um, until until you collide with reality in some ways. And this is often what happens to a lot of young people, around the age of 12 or 13 or 14 or something like that, is they can
Mm.
become quite cynical and pouty and rebellious and kind of dark all of a sudden. So you have the sweet children of elementary school, and then you get into middle school and you start to get like these rebellious dark teenagers who are wearing goth clothing or starting to smoke cigarettes or um, starting to say like "fuck you, mom and dad" kind of thing. And there's kind of this collision with reality where like you are leaving the place of innocence and purity and sort
Yeah.
of being stained, being corrupted in some sense. But as part of the process of maturation and growth and getting hopefully beyond cynicism to a place of competency and
Mm.
sovereignty and resilience and wisdom in the world. And
Yeah.
that's kind of Persephone's story.
Yeah. These rich images of, the flowering, the holding of the plants, representing just that pureness, is part of the young Persephone before she has really been initiated into the depths, you might say. And as we move into her mythology of her abduction, we start to see not only an aspect of the splitting away from that youthful principle, but also what happens when the aspect of the mother is too devouring. So to really get into the story, this image is nice because we see Persephone sort of standing at this statue of her mother, like holding the grains, and in the right side is Zeus or Hades coming, excuse me, on his chariot, ready to take her away. Um, so the story really begins with Persephone walking through the fields of flowers and sees a particular one and goes to pick it up. And as she does so, the ground opens up and Hades appears and he abducts Persephone. Um, and this is actually done with Zeus's permission, but unbeknownst to Demeter herself. And as she Mhm.
I was gonna say, isn't it at Zeus's behest? Doesn't he call upon Hades to do this?
No, it's more like he gives permission.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Something else I was gonna say is like what's up with Hades his bident?
Oh, the Biden. Yeah, it's
Not the
interesting
trident,
because
but the
yeah,
bident. He's depicted with this two-pronged spear,
yeah,
essentially.
yeah. Um, it's I don't know. It's interesting because um, Poseidon often has the trident,
Hmm.
and I don't think Zeus has any form of a staff necessarily that I know of. But I don't know. I don't know really what the significance of it is, where it's often drawn from. But he often in a lot of imagery and in sculptures and things like that holds the bident.
You have to wonder if the bident was actually a tool that was used for a specific purpose back in
Right. It's like a
ancient times.
pitchfork, right? It looks like something that you might be plowing with or working the
Yeah,
fields with,
working with grain or something like
working
that.
with grain, right? And if we're to connect Hades to his principle of riches, the Pluton side, there is this dynamic connection ultimately between the
Mhm.
the agricultural principle that manifests on top of the soil, which you would say is the Demeter half, but all of the riches and the depths and the roots that are coming up from the bottom. And that would be more of like the Hades Persephone principle. So there's sort of a connection to the the tools of agriculture, you might say. And the Bident surely looks like one.
It's interesting because when you look up Biden on Wikipedia, it says that
Mhm.
like uh, Poseidon has a trident, and then Hades has a bident, and that
Yeah.
Zeus has a single point, which is his lightning bolt. And so they are
Ah,
a
okay.
trinity in some way,
Interesting.
which I think is
Interesting.
interesting to think about. Um, yeah, so like the lightning bolt is a spear essentially. So
Yeah.
they have some sort of trinity going on with their weapons or salves or something like that,
Yeah,
which is
and they
interesting.
already are a sort of a trinity of brothers,
Right.
ruling over the different domains of the earth. Anyways,
Okay.
so moving
Back
on,
to the myth.
back to the myth.
Uh, Persephone is out in the field. She's still the
Mhm.
maiden. She's maybe like tra la 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 la, like through the fields picking flowers.
Yeah.
Um, and then the ground opens up, right? And Hades
Yeah. Yeah.
comes out in his
He
chariot.
emerges. Yeah.
And this is the uh, most prominent, I think, myth, or the thing that features Hades and Persephone the most prominently, and has been
Yes,
depicted the most prominently through
for sure.
paintings. Um,
Mhm.
like if you look at Hades and Persephone, the main thing that comes up is this myth, this kind of moment of
Yeah.
Hades stealing Persephone, or the rape of Persephone. Persephone, as
Mhm.
it's sometimes phrased. You can see it in the sculpture. This is the rape of Persephone. Hades is grabbing uh, Persephone, or Kore, the maiden. Um, Cerberus is there in the background, as always. Um, and there's, as you can see, a lot of different depictions of this.
Yeah.
And it's all the same kind of story. He takes Persephone, he takes her to the underworld, essentially. And
Mhm.
the kind of significance of this is that the maiden is sort of violently coming into contact with the masculine,
Yeah.
and it's going to transform her, and it's going to um, end her phase, her puella phase, and her purity and her innocence, and transform her into the queen of the underworld. Um, or the bringer of destruction, which is what
Yeah.
Persephone means.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot packed into that. Why is it such a prominent myth? Why is it so powerful? Why is it focused on so much? And what is the significance of the symbolism of the myth?
Yeah. There's so much to get into, just on the one hand, about the idea of the interaction, the first interaction that the Puella has with the masculine principle. And as we see with all classic sort of heroine and hero journey story, there is this coming together of the principles of the masculine and the feminine that completely alters the individual, that's kind of drawing them into further maturation, that's forcing them to get into a place, not only psychologically, but in an embodied way, being forced to shift and change and come into relationship with a totally new principle that ultimately ends in some sort of union, which we could call an integration or a deeper understanding, so that the hero eventually marries, the princess, or the heroine's journey finds her way to um, working with the masculine principle in a way that integrates it also. And sometimes that's like a divine marriage, or sometimes that is her tapping into a more masculine aspect of herself. So we can see Kore, young Persephone, as only interacting with principles of the feminine. Within herself, she is the uninitiated maiden. With the mother, it is that totality of nurturance and being held within the kind of warm arms of Demeter, safety, food, abundance, care. There isn't a sense of being pushed out of those gates into the realms of challenge and hardship. She's meant to be kept in these graceful fields where all of her friends are nymphs and life is good and Demeter watches over her. But that can only go so far for any individual. And you can move into that psychological arena of the puer complex or the puella complex, which is like Peter Pan syndrome type. We have an episode on that if you want to know more. But essentially, being in the place of an eternal child, never really moving into adulthood, never moving into maturity, because you stay within the realm of that safe haven.
And so part of the way that we come into who we're meant to be, or that we be mature as adults, that we grow, is that we have to confront the unknown,
Mm,
right?
hmm.
And that can be in
Sure.
a very sort
Yeah.
of extroverted sense, where like you actually need to go out into the world and explore it and
Mm,
conquer it in some way, whether
hmm.
that just means getting a job, or supporting yourself, or sort of figuring out how to live your life. That's part of the path of maturation, is to do that. If you don't do that, you stay puella forever. And parents can, play a role in keeping their children from actually venturing into the unknown and experiencing
Yeah.
that that darkness. But that's the path of growth. And there's not only the extroverted sense of that, but there's also the introverted sense of that, where it's like you need to actually confront the unknown in yourself. and
Mm,
you need
mhm.
to look at the things within you that you either don't want to look at or it's too difficult to look at. You have to integrate some of the things that have happened to you as a child, and that's a lifelong process that people go through where they're sort of confronting their childhood trauma, etc. But all that has to do with sort of a collision with the unknown that forces maturation, and hopefully that can be smooth and be integrated in a sort of incremental, gradual way. But
Mm.
often it's quite violent, and
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
a collision with the unknown that can feel very chaotic and very destructive, and it can really shake the foundations of your existence.
yeah,
Um, and that is probably more common than the opposite. I think the sort of violent collision with reality that really shakes you up and kind of wrecks you and wrecks your life in favor of you having to kind of like rebuild and be reborn into the adult is probably a more common thing for people as they
yeah,
grow up.
yeah,
This
absolutely.
myth is depicting that. So Hades as the golden shadow, Hades as the unknown, Hades as the sort of invisible, the world below or the underworld, the personal underworld. He collides with Persephone, um, and that masculine energy of consciousness takes her, and she has to um, become the queen.
Yeah, yeah. That experience of the underworld in this case, and there are, as Aaron's mentioning, many paths into the underworld. And if we want to think about it mythologically, there's all of these ways in which different figures enter, sometimes willingly and consciously from the light of day. They move down into the depths, into the underworld space, into the unconscious. But at times, the experience of the underworld is overwhelming, it's sudden, it rips you like it rips life open to a new reality, and it threatens like what is the kind of ruling intact psychological system that you have. So that experience of the unconscious, aka the underworld or Hades, it feels like a violation. And I like to view the abduction of Persephone in this way because when these factors bubble up inside of us and they totally throw things off, when they shift how we start to view ourselves or reality, where it shows us things that we don't know how to cope with, um, where it forces us into a place where we either become overwhelmed or destroyed, or we overcome and we integrate. This is the moment of Persephone being stolen into the underworld, and is a violation. It feels like some part of you is being destroyed. That's the creative moment. This is where things really begin to happen, and where change and development can really take hold in an individual.
So Hades takes Persephone into the underworld, and the story is that Demeter becomes very distraught over this, over
Mhm.
losing her daughter. Um, and because Demeter is sort of the mother of the harvest and the sort of fertility of the earth, um, her weeping, her depression brings the earth into a sort of endless winter where nothing will grow and everything is cold and dark. And she is running around searching for her daughter. Um, so the whole world is plunged into a kind of famine and again endless winter. So
Mm.
um, Persephone's in the underworld, and Hades has her down there, and um, you can take it from here. Demeter contacts Zeus, right? Pleads with
Yeah,
Zeus.
we're seeing essentially the aspects of the great mother archetype that can take life away, that can destroy, that on the one hand provides the abundance and the harvest, and then on the other hand brings a natural destruction to everything. So the world is experiencing that, and many gods begin to plead with Demeter, and nothing works. And so eventually they decide. Um, that Persephone needs to be brought back up to Demeter for this to stop, and there's an agreement. So, Hermes is sent to go into the underworld to bring Persephone back, but while that happens, she eats a few pomegranate seeds, which sort of symbolize, I think, on the one hand, marriage, union between individuals, and a marking then of that consummation of the marriage, but also something of the underworld has been taken in and metabolized, taken into her system. So she's changed. So as she is brought back up to her mother and reunited, she's asked, "Did you eat anything while you were in the underworld?" And she says, "Yes." And because of that, Persephone has to spend a portion of the year down in the underworld with Hades, and another portion she is able to be reunited with her mother. And so this brings a balance back. This brings life back to the land. Demeter begins taking up her role again as that goddess of the earth and as the harvest, but we also then begin to see that cyclical way in which the seasons change, as Persephone goes back down underneath to Hades. The plants begin to wither. Autumn comes, winter. The earth begins to go back into a kind of dark, withdrawn, introverted, shadowy place. And as she emerges again in February, spring returns. And so we see this kind of eternal cycle of life and death and natural cycles that are reflected in the mother daughter relationship.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting the pomegranate seeds, as you were saying, there is sort of not to get too graphic here, but there is kind of the notion of like the masculine planting the seed inside the feminine, um, consummating the marriage, right? Hades impregnating Persephone in some sense with a seed, and that there's kind of the more like literal interpretation of what that means is that when a virgin loses her virginity and she gets pregnant, that she's sort of transported suddenly from being a maiden to being a woman, and she has to embark on this new stage of her feminine journey, which is that of being a mother. And so the pomegranate seed, in some sense, is that seed. Like Persephone is impregnated by Hades, um, but there's other layers to how you can interpret these ideas, and I mean that's true even in our reality. It's like there's not only the literal physical getting pregnant, but there's also the sort of the masculine planting its seed of consciousness in you.
Mm,
And
hmm.
so Hades has touched Persephone, and he has sort of woken her up in some way, and
Yeah,
she can't really ever go back to being a child. And even though
yeah,
Demeter, the mother, is saying like, "Bring me back my baby, bring her back," it's like your baby's gone, and she can't actually ever go back. She has to move forward, not backwards. She has to move forwards into becoming the queen of the underworld, um, and becoming the sort of the master of her own unconscious. So this masculine collision that Persephone experiences is a collision with her darkness. It's the collision with reality. It's the sort of harshness of your existence that you have to face. So Hades represents that, but it's also that darkness which ultimately plants the seed of consciousness that will grow inside of Persephone, and
yeah,
she will get into the right relationship with her darkness, as you might say, become queen of the underworld.
yeah.
Um, so the symbolism here is very interesting in that sense.
Yeah, in contrast, we have figures in the pantheon who are considered to be virginal goddesses like Artemis or Athena, who don't have the complexity that Persephone has. And despite there not being as many stories or mythologies around Persephone and Hades, ultimately, with the limited knowledge that we have, we see a kind of variety of her character and a shift from young maiden into queen of the underworld, so that we have the sort of psychological image of her in the fields with the flowers and the nymphs and her mother and the harvest, but then we also have her dark depths. We have her interacting in Hades. We see her ruling as the queen. And when you compare that to Artemis as an example, we don't see that evolution. She stays a virgin. She actually kind of makes a deal with her father Zeus that she never has to marry, that she never has to commit to herself to another. Same with Hestia, same with Athena. And we can look at those through a lens of a sort of facet of the Puella archetype, that stays the girl forever. But Persephone instead shows us the various stages of the development of the feminine principle. And because of that, she can work as a sort of psychological initiating factor for other feminine aspects that come into the underworld, which we'll get to later.
So this image specifically is Demeter receiving Persephone from the
Yeah,
underworld. That's
yeah,
Hermes
yeah.
carrying her up, I guess, flying her out of the underworld.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah,
this is a pretty famous painting, I think.
yeah.
Um, anyways, but Persephone takes her place like at the throne next to Hades, and even though she comes in and out of the underworld for parts of the year, um, she becomes the bringer of destruction uh, and the queen of the underworld. And
Yeah,
maybe we should get into the bringer of destruction aspect because that does seem kind of strange, right? That she goes
it's
from
very
being
interesting.
maiden Kore to Persephone,
Yeah.
uh, bringer of destruction. So
Yeah.
what's the deal with that? It seems almost like a little extreme of like
Well,
you were a little
it's
girl, now you are like the dragon of destruction.
well, I think it's interesting to ultimately tie back these words, destruction, death, to the aspect of the unconscious or the darkness or the shadow that is a disintegrating principle and works to sort of balance out the integrating principle of consciousness or of light, you might say. So we need the balance to that. And to embody being an underworld figure truly is to, in some ways, mirror what Hades is doing as well, right? Which is in part there's a abundance to it, there's a riches principle to it, that Pluto principle, but there's also the aspect of death, and death is ultimately about change and shifts and structures sort of dissolving and rebuilding or becoming something else. And I think for Persephone to have this kind of title as being a goddess of death or of destruction is to show that she is stepping into an aspect of the feminine that is mature, which is bivalent, you might say, which is that it can bring life and it can also take life away. So, just as her mother does this above the earth, we also need that aspect below. And when when an individual kind of interacts with that aspect of the Persephone principle that is destruction, it's the part of the unconscious that ultimately comes in as like that defeat of the ego or the defeat of consciousness, where you understand that there is something more powerful that is taking hold and bringing change. So that aspect of destruction is ultimately tied to the generative cycle as well.
Right. So the sort of integration, disintegration in
Mm,
favor of reintegration.
sure, yeah. Mhm, mhm.
Um,
Yeah,
it recalls the fairy tale of Vasilisa,
yeah.
where
Mhm.
she goes from being the Puella, she has to undertake these tasks with Baba Yaga, and then her reward is that she receives this flaming skull, and that's kind
Yeah,
of represents that her transformation from being the maiden to being the woman, and that she becomes um, independent and sovereign because she has mastered uh, this sort of destructive artifact. And she goes and then
mhm.
she blows up her evil stepsisters and stepmom with this flaming skull. So Vasilisa becomes this bringer of destruction as part of
Yeah,
her womanhood.
Yeah, I think it's an important aspect of the feminine principle that isn't always focused on, at least consciously, especially in our modern society, but there is a part of the feminine that has an equal, destructive nature to it, and maybe it's different than the masculine's overt style of destruction, but for a woman to really come into her own, or for an individual to work on that feminine principle is to understand the death aspect of it, the destructive aspect of it, the devouring aspect, and that brings that depth of maturity that you need to at least have some sense of balance between the light and dark aspects of the feminine.
So here's just some more imagery of Hades and Persephone together. I don't know
This
what
is
this
an
is.
this is
You've
an
added a bunch of
image
images to the slideshow. I was not prepared for.
This is an image that is depicting, rites of the Elizanian mysteries, which I just wanted to briefly touch on as,
Hmm.
um, parts of Demeter and Persephone's story that were taken into the Greek culture and had a whole set of rituals built around, and it's really shrouded in a lot of mystery, but the mysteries themselves, follow the rebirth of Persephone, which is symbolizes this aspect of eternal life that really flows not only from generation to generation, but from season to season. Um, and there are these different rites and ceremonies and experiences, that were woven into the mysteries themselves that enacted, Persephone, going into the underworld or rising, or even the union of Zeus and Demeter. And it became this central religion, to the degree that even, I think like Marcus Aurelius was initiated into the Elizanian mysteries,
Hmm.
many famous philosophers as well. And so their story was incredibly central to the understanding of the Greek psyche, representing not only life and death, rebirth, but the kind of mysteries of the earth and of the afterlife that came from it. So just shows how ultimately how important, this was as a central story to the culture.
And the themes here are there's sort of a descending and then there's an ascending, right?
Hmm.
And it's
Hmm.
supposed to uh, evoke these themes of destruction or disintegration and reintegration in the sense that sort of destruction is part of life, right?
Yeah.
Or that going downward is what you need to do to go up. It's like you need to go into the shadow in order to
Mm.
ascend to the light. Um, and it's a really important pattern of becoming that I think you can see like um, all over the place. And just like if you think of like part of the life cycle of forests is to have fires, right? Like
Yeah.
there's all this dead wood on the ground. There's all this like
Yeah.
stuff that needs to be disintegrated, and that's actually healthy for the forest to have fires occasionally. That's like why they do controlled burns, is because it's healthy to have a destructive disintegrative process in favor of life. Um, and so this pattern of sort of descending into the underworld and then ascending, and this rebirth that happens when something burns down. Um, Again, you can see that theme everywhere. So it's very interesting to see a cult essentially built around that, a religion built around that, because it's
Yeah.
um, such an important theme to understand in life.
Mm.
Okay, so some of the other myths where Hades appears, Hades and Persephone appear. We just want to touch on those real quick because it's interesting. Um, Hercules has an interesting relationship with Hades. Um, they interact a decent amount in different myths. I believe that Hercules and Hades even fight at some point, and Hades is wounded by Hercules
Yeah.
and has to go up to Mount Olympus to heal. Um, but anyways, one of Hercules, I guess the last labor of Hercules, I believe, is that he
Mm,
needs to uh, go and get Cerberus,
yeah.
and this is a labor given to him by Eurystheus. Is that how you say it?
Mhm. Mhm.
And
Yeah.
it's supposed to be an impossible labor. Like it's like there's no way you've achieved all these impossible things so far, but I'm going to give you like the most impossible thing ever. It's like you need to go down to the underworld and bring back Cerberus, and it's like that's impossible. Good luck. Um, but Hercules actually goes to Hades and asks him if he can borrow Cerberus essentially, and Hades, being his altruistic, fairly reasonable self, says you can have Cerberus, you can borrow Cerberus, but you have to not hurt him. Like don't hurt my dog, but you can take my dog for a little bit if you need to. Um, so again, part of the themes around the labors of Hercules is his repeated need to sort of journey into the darkness, or
Mm.
journey to a cave to fight the lion, or to fight a hydra which is coming out of some hole in the ground, or shoot these birds that are coming out of the swamp. So there's all these representations of sort of the shadow that Hercules needs to venture into in order to transform and become stronger. And so him traveling into the underworld to get Cerberus again is a representation of that. Is Hades is sort of a manifestation of wisdom,
Mhm.
or
Yeah.
of initiation, or what you
Like
need.
a mature masculine
Yeah.
principle for if you look at a lot of the labors for Hercules, what we're seeing is him having to integrate a new way of being, a new way of interacting with the world that is um, not in line with how he usually handles things. So to capture Cerberus, it isn't to kill Cerberus. It's you have to claim him without hurting him. You have to wrestle with him and subdue that kind of wild principle and then take it above earth and show that you've completed the task. But he's being guided by Hades, who we can see as that more mature, integrated, wiser, balanced masculine principle who's kind of leading him into deeper maturity.
We have an episode on the labors of Hercules, where we
Mhm.
cover the first six, I believe, um,
Yeah.
and you can look that up. Uh, it's a really interesting collection of stories and a lot
Mhm.
of really interesting themes there. Uh, this is Orpheus
Yeah.
uh, venturing into the underworld to bring back his dead wife, Eurydice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, I like this painting. It's funny because you have Orpheus. He has like this little violin with him, and like that's his instrument. It's kind of usually he has a harp, but here he has like this very
Yeah.
small violin.
A
Um,
liar.
yeah, and you see Hades and Persephone sitting on the throne of the underworld. Hades has the bident again. He has that two-pronged spear,
Cool.
and you can
Mhm.
see obedient little Cerberus at their feet. Um, but this is a famous myth. Orpheus goes down to the underworld to retrieve his wife, and he plays such beautiful music that it moves Hades and it moves Persephone, and they uh, say that Orpheus can have his wife back if he won't turn around before they're both out of the underworld. So he cannot look back. And so they travel up to the surface of the underworld, and Orpheus is so excited that he's achieved this impossible mission that he turns back to look at his wife, but his wife is not out of the underworld quite yet, and so she suddenly fades and sort of disappears back into the underworld, and this time she is gone forever.
Yeah.
Um, so that in itself has some interesting, symbolism there, and sort of like a moral lesson, but again here you have the journeying into the shadow going down, and some sort of attempt to learn something, or bring back the feminine aspect, um, or undergo some kind of transformation, and Hades is the person you go to engage in that process.
There's also the aspect of, like, a set of rules being laid out, like, if you do this exactly, you will succeed, you will be able to take your wife back from the underworld, which is, by the way, totally unheard of, like, you don't
Mhm.
just get to come back to life. The fact that Hades and Persephone have agreed to this is in and of itself already quite miraculous, but when the parameters are not met and Orpheus turns around and looks at Eurydice, sorry, like there's really no more discussion about it. That principle of order, you might say, that Hades is keeping in in the underworld space has to be met. And so unfortunately, this means that he loses Eurydice forever, but it also shows that Hades is a figure who isn't emotionless or doesn't have these qualities of compassion. Um, he's quite as his breadth of expression is just as great as any of the other pantheon members. He's just a more shadowy figure, but in that way, he still has that expression of sort of godly humanness, you might say. He is not a devil figure. He's not a punishing figure. He is an authority figure, really a wisdom figure as well.
Mhm.
This is a Psyche interacting with Cerberus, and the Psyche and Eros story is more of a heroine's journey, and her last task is to journey into the underworld and to get back a box of like beauty ointment from Persephone. This was a task given to her from Aphrodite. And what's interesting about the interaction with Cerberus and the kind of differences we see between the masculine and the feminine principle is that when Hercules came into the underworld, he had to wrestle with Cerberus, or at least that was how he decided he would gain Cerberus and bring him back up to the surface. But with Psyche, and an aspect more of coming into relationship with something rather than trying to wrestle it into submission, she gives Cerberus these honey cakes and he just chomps on them and she's able to pass by. So it's a really interesting difference that we see between the evolution and the maturity happening in the masculine principle versus the feminine principle.
This myth is interesting. Persephone is the one that Psyche interacts with, and this painting is showing the sort of the progression of events that um, Psyche has to travel all the way through the underworld. She has to cross the river Styx. Um, she has to ignore people in the underworld that are pleading for her to rescue them, and she has to go to Persephone and ask for this box. And so you can see Persephone in the top left is presenting this box to Psyche, and then she has to travel back to the surface. She can't open the box before she gets to the surface. That's the idea, right?
Yeah,
But she can't help herself and she opens the
yeah,
box and it's what pours out is sort of like this sleep, like it um just drives her into a state of unconsciousness.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And then
She passes out.
right. And then Cupid or Eros comes and wakes her up and then brings her to Mount Olympus and they have a wedding, right? Zeus allows her to become a god
Yeah,
because
yeah.
she's like learned her lesson or she's done the tasks. She's gone through the transformation to become a woman.
Mm,
Um, so interesting symbolism here.
yeah,
Persephone is sort of playing this role again of feminine wisdom or feminine initiator, where Psyche needs to make contact with this feminine wisdom in order to initiate into full womanhood, and she had to go to the underworld to do that. And so again, you're seeing similar themes of I need to go into the underworld in order to be initiated or to be transformed. And Persephone and Hades are the personification of that process, you might say.
yeah. It's showing that ultimately through her own journey, which would certainly be considered that of a heroine's journey of development into further maturity. By doing so, by going through her own process, Persephone then becomes a female initiator for other figures who she interacts with, so that not only does it allow them to bring out the feminine principle inside of themselves, whether they be a male character or a female character, but she in turn stands then as a more integrated feminine in and of herself. And when that happens, and this is very true when we look at wiser aspects of the feminine, like the mother or ultimately the crone figure, is that you in turn draw the younger, uninitiated aspects of psyche into greater consciousness. Similar to what we were talking about with Vasilisa, she gains the skull of fire and destruction by working with Baba Yaga, who is this very bivalent, great mother figure who has the wisdom of the light and the wisdom of the dark. And Persephone becomes a version of that. And you see it throughout the different stories and the different characters that she interacts with.
If there's any questions before we wrap it up, we will do our best to answer them. Only if it's a good question and only if we like it, of course. No guarantees. It's been an interesting turnout, pretty low compared to the last few sessions we've done. And it's hard to know why that is exactly, but
it ebbs and flows, right?
Ebbs and flows.
Yeah. Well, if there aren't any questions, for anyone watching this later on, feel free to always drop your questions later and we'll look at them. Or if there's a topic that you'd like us to cover in a future live stream, we are always curious to know. So leave us a comment. Let us know what you'd like to see us talk about.
All right, I guess that's it. Tune in next week for another YouTube Live. We're going to try and cover a wide breadth of topics again to demonstrate our versatility. We haven't picked a topic yet, so we're not sure what we're going to do, but it should be at the same time next week. So tune in then, and we will see you next time. If you find our content useful, please consider supporting us on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/goldenshadow.org.
If you'd like to keep up with my explorations, musings, and stay updated on the project, subscribe to the Golden Shadow Journal at goldenshadow.substack.com.
Thanks for watching.
See you later.